Okay, thank you. I now am very pleased to introduce our next panel that will drill down a little deeper in the particular priorities that we have in particular policy areas. I am going to introduce our panelists. Oh, no, never mind. I'm going to introduce our Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Virginia Bennett. While she only joined us a couple months ago, she's been absolutely fabulous well, she's my boss, so, but other than that, she's also fabulous in helping us pursue our policies and priorities here within the building and outwardly. So she will be moderating the panel today. Thank you very much, Pete S. Bennett.
You can tell we're seamlessly coordinated. I actually am really delighted to be here, and I'm going to not talk to you for very long and let my colleagues sort of get down to a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of what we're doing in their respective areas of expertise, and where we need your help, honestly, to really try and implement, on a very granular basis overseas, what, programs that advance our priorities. I know that my boss, Tom Malinowski, has talked to you about what sort of those overarching priorities are. And I just want to offer just one little personal experience, which is that I'm a career Foreign Service officer, and I really, over the course of my 2+ decades in this business, I can tell you that what we do overseas to advance democracy and human rights in whatever niche program we're talking about is really the most inspiring and motivating work that any of us have the privilege of doing. And it's because of our implementing partners overseas, which you all are, here to really represent. So I am, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleagues, just to talk, maybe first introduce themselves, and then to talk about what they do, whether it's disability rights, whether it's internet freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then after that, we'll open it up to questions, and I'm happy to call on folks when we get to that point. So, you guys, take it away. Just go left to right, maybe.
So, good morning. My name is Judy Heumann. I'm the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights here at the State Department. This is a position that started in 2010. And so I'd like to give you a few bits of information on the work that we're doing. Let me preface this by saying that there was a report that was released in 2011 by the World Bank and the World Health Organization, which says that there are at least 15% persons with disabilities living in the world today, and that 80% of those individuals are living in developing countries. Disability is cuts across all walks of life, and people who become disabled are not necessarily born with their disabilities. In fact, people are more likely to be acquiring their disabilities across the life expectancy. And from a human rights perspective, if you look at the data that came out of this report, it's called the World Report on Disability, and it was 2011. It's a quick read, so I'd suggest that you look at it. But basically, the rights of disabled people in many countries around the world are denied across the board. Basic right to education. In certain countries, disabled people are not necessarily registered and therefore are unable to get benefits. Lack of job opportunities, and one of the biggest issues is stigma, because in many countries there's a belief that if one has a disability, it's because of a sin that was done or committed by a family member. So what we've been trying to do here at the State Department, with our office playing an important role, and GP has played a critical role in this, is looking at what we need to do to ensure that disability is integrated into the programming work that we're doing. I think this is really the most important message to put forth to you, that we have a high expectation that grantees will look, when you're applying for funds, at how disabled individuals can fit into the work that you're doing. So if you're doing work in the area of gender, There are many different ways that you can be ensuring that disabled women are included in the rights-based work that you're doing. It's very important that in the countries that you're working in, you get a better understanding of the disability rights organizations that exist in those countries. And many, many countries have an increasing number of disability rights organizations that you may know about or your organizations may already be working with. Disability, as I was saying a few minutes ago, is the result of someone being born with a disability. But it's more likely, as people become older, to be acquired in relationship to conflict, violence in the area of rape, landmines, post-traumatic stress, et cetera. We're talking about people who have invisible disabilities, diabetes, epilepsy, as well as individuals who have visible disabilities, blindness, deafness, low vision, hard of hearing, and other forms of physical disabilities. But the most important point here is to remember that the rights of disabled people are being violated. They're being violated because enough attention has not been paid by donors and others who are working within countries to be able to say that this population is critical. When you're doing work in the area of LGBT, in labor, whatever it may be, there are populations of disabled people who are affected. And so our office is very happy to help you, as well as GP. But at the end of the day, you'll see that we've had an increasing number of projects which are being funded that are focusing both on the inclusion of disabled people in work, as well in our work, as well as in specific grants that are being awarded. The Disabilities Treaty, or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, was adopted by the United Nations in 2006. 152 countries have ratified the treaty. That means that the main discussion in the area of disability around the world is implementation of the treaty. The treaty is based on the principles of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so you can see there are huge opportunities. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Peterson. Please ignore the name tag. That was my deputy who is unwell today, so we're doing a quick change around. I'm the director of the Office for Multilateral and Global Affairs, and I'd like to speak briefly about our overall U.S. government engagement on LGBT. Our engagement is grounded in the December 2011 Presidential Memorandum on International Initiatives to Advance the Human Rights of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Persons. This calls on all agencies operating abroad to use foreign assistance tools to advance the human rights of LGBT persons. We have focused our areas on several pillars laid out in that memorandum. We are working on combating criminalization, either through directly taking on countries that currently do have laws on the books that criminalize LGBT status or conduct. But we are also moving more now into looking at countries that may be looking to pass new laws. Even if they already have laws on the books, they may be looking to pass tougher legislation, or they may not actually have laws on the books yet, but are copying from others in their regions or spheres of influence. We look to protect vulnerable LGBT refugees and asylum seekers. When the memorandum was laid out in 2011, there was a fairly extensive refugee and asylum policy put into place. That is requiring a new look now as circumstances worldwide make it increasingly difficult for LGBT people to find a place of refuge. For example, if people were living in Uganda when the new legislation was passed and moved into Kenya to seek refuge, they were moving from one criminalized environment to another. So this is an area that needs constant evaluation and fine-tuning. Memorandum calls on the government agencies to use foreign assistance to protect human rights and advance non-discrimination. We are engaged in public-private partnerships, particularly through the Global Equality Fund, which has both government and private sector contributors to engage in programs that either provide emergency support or engage in capacity building or overall structural approaches to help civil society groups take on legislation and environments in the countries that they're working in. We are also working to, we at state have implemented and are trying to get other agencies, other US government agencies, to practice non-discrimination in their contracts and grants. So even if a grant is not specifically related to LGBT, ensure that implementing partners are not themselves violating the rights of LGBT persons in moving whatever activity they may be engaged in forward. The memorandum called for swift and meaningful US responses to human rights abuses of LGBT persons. A number of urgent response mechanisms were developed in the immediate aftermath of the issuance of the memorandum. So we are able to provide emergency assistance to activists who are under threat or individuals who are under threat. And finally, we've been called on to engage international organizations in the fight against LGBT discrimination. The first salvo in this was the 2011 UN Human Rights Council resolution on LGBT rights, recently renewed at the most recent Human Rights Council session after great difficulty pulling in appropriate international partners, gaining the buy-in from sponsors that we needed. The good news story from this most recent round of Human Rights Council activity is that we actually had a much larger margin of victory this time around. So as difficult as it has been to get that international engagement, it does look like things are moving in the right direction. We're also not simply using human rights fora. We, working with our Health and Human Services colleagues, were able to very effectively engage on an LGBT resolution in the Pan American Health Organization, and would like to use that as sort of a model for engaging in other regions on the rights of LGBT persons. As we have moved forward, looking at that basic foundation, areas that we know that we need to expand on are addressing violence and societal discrimination. There are countries out there that do have the right laws in place, but LGBT persons in their countries still face very high levels of violence or discrimination. This provides us an opportunity to partner with those governments to find a way forward, to work within their legislative framework to get to the hearts and mind issue of the discrimination and violence. We are also looking, as we move forward, to strengthen other voices. So finding those key partnerships in other regions of the world so that it's not simply northern and western governments that are advocating most strongly for this, but particularly Latin America may have targets of opportunity. We're also looking to do more with the business community, not simply through their partnership on the Global Equality Fund, but also finding ways of giving them stronger voice or getting them to better use their voice as they're going into countries with restrictive environments to make sure that they are carrying this message forward as well. And finally, we're looking to do more with faith communities so that we are able to counter some of the very negative voices that have come through from faith communities in the recent years. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. My name is Bruce Levine. I'm director of the Labor Office in DRL. And, you know, for the vast majority of people in the world, everyone has to make a living somehow. And labor rights is the area of human rights that may arguably have the most impact on people's daily lives. You know, without giving short shrift to any of the other issues that this Bureau works on, it's the one issue that affects a world in which the majority of people are poor and the majority of people live in countries where rights are not fully protected. People have a right to make a living, and they have a right to get the most that they can from their labor and benefit the most from their labor that they possibly can. And if they're in situations where access to opportunities and to occupations is being denied on the basis of discrimination, on the basis of gender, because they're disabled, because they are of their political beliefs or religious beliefs, there's a problem. If people are unable to exercise their freedom of association, which could mean joining unions or could also simply mean getting together with like-minded people to lobby their government, if they're being denied that to amplify their voice and get their grievances aired, then there is a problem. And if children are being sent to work instead of going to school, there is a problem of basic rights. And these problems are far too common. And this has long been recognized by the United States. As early as the 1930s, we began drafting certain labor rights criteria into our trade legislation. And with each passing decade, the connection between trade and labor becomes more detailed and more obvious. And I think you'll see the most recent trade agreements we signed have rather detailed labor requirements, all of which are based on ILO core labor standards, plus something called the acceptable conditions of work. And it's around these concepts that our Bureau makes its efforts to promote labor rights throughout the world. We do so through a variety of tools, of which programming is only one. We have diplomacy, we have policy instruments like trade agreements, and we work very hard. In the programming side now, I would say that the majority of our work goes towards the training and development of workers' organizations around the world within the contexts of their respective countries. And this is fruitful work. These are some of the best contacts we have and often spills over into other areas of democracy and governance in a very positive way. But in addition to that, we look at the issue of informality, which is when workers are basically working for themselves and don't really have any bargaining power. How can people in the informal sector get better respect for their rights through organizing, through lobbying, through organizing themselves into cooperatives or whatever. So increasingly, we're interested in programs about that. And the final area of interest, which I would say is sort of a growth industry for this Bureau, is the issue of labor migration. There are 100 to 200 million people, depending on whom you ask, who are migrating simply to find jobs, not because they want to live in another country, not because they're being forced out. And these people fall through the cracks. They're not protected by the labor laws of their sending countries, and they're not protected well within receiving countries. And so that's an area of interest for us. Increasingly, we're also trying to partner with other like-minded countries, particularly the EU, and I think you'll see that rolling out in places like Bangladesh, maybe Burma, and hopefully other locations. We have new and innovative programs that are South-South, where we bring together, for example, trade unions in Brazil and trade unions in Mozambique to promote trade union rights. So it's a changing environment, but one that we continue to think is extremely relevant, extremely important, and forms the basis for better respect for human rights and rule of law more generally. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Shelley Dittmer. I'm the acting director in the Office of International Religious Freedom. It's been kind of a rough year for religious freedom, and a couple of years for religious freedom, and there's lots of room for innovative programs. I wanted to start by talking about something that I've seen can be a source of confusion, which is what is the difference between religious freedom outreach and programming and religious engagement? So religious engagement is basically anytime you have a program or something and you're reaching out, and that community that you're reaching out to includes religious leaders. So for example, if you're working on a reconciliation or peace project and you're bringing together leaders from different religious groups, that's religious engagement. It's not necessarily, however, a religious freedom program. it's only a religious freedom program if the source of the conflict or contention is based in sectarian or interreligious conflict. Again, for example, if you have religious leaders working on poverty, if you have them working on discrimination, if you're working with them in any sector, this is religious engagement and it's wonderful. But for our purposes, a religious freedom project really has to focus on the underlying religious freedom issues in the area, which may or may not include bringing together religious leaders, or it might include bringing together members of the community, or other such activities. So one of the things we've noticed too is we've done and we've seen a lot of interfaith projects, set up an interfaith council, do interfaith dialogue, and these can be really important, and they can be a really important first step, particularly in a community. If you have a community where people aren't talking to each other at all or refuse to acknowledge the other group exists, or for example, the Ahmadiyya Muslims, in many cases, Muslims refuse to acknowledge that they're Muslim, and this is a source of conflict, and things like that, it can be useful to bring people in the same room and get them to actually talk to each other. But that really needs to be just a first step. It can't be the purpose of a program. The purpose of the program needs to be getting at whatever the underlying religious freedom issue is in that country or in that community. So, for example, if the underlying religious freedom problem in that community is that apostasy is viewed as a highly negative thing, and someone can be accused of apostasy, rightly or wrongly, and then either arrested or equally as likely killed by mob justice or vigilantes, this is the underlying problem we're trying to get at. So interfaith may or may not help that problem, but whatever we're going to do, if you're saying, well, we're going to bring members of the community together, well, that's great, but what is the point? What is the purpose? How are you going to address the underlying problem in that region? And so for us, and sometimes it can be, we will write our request for proposals very flexibly because we want to give people the opportunity to write programs that fit them and that fit the community. And honestly, sometimes we have to not hide, but present the program in a way that we're not necessarily going to go out and say, we're doing a religious freedom program, because that doesn't always go over so well. But what I want to see is I want to know that you understand the difference between religious freedom and religious engagement, and that you are looking at addressing the underlying problem that we're trying to solve or make progress on an underlying religious freedom issue. So that I know that the goals of the program and that the activities of the program are trying to reach that goal. Because we see a lot of things of, we're going to bring people together. Okay. But then what? And so for us, especially going forward, I think you're going to see a lot of pushback from us of, okay, and then what do you think that will solve? So I'll leave it at that, but happy to take questions.
Greetings. I am not Deputy Assistant Secretary Scott Busby, if you're looking at your agenda, nor am I Director Lisa Peterson, both of whom work on the policy side of Internet freedom. I'm Steve Schultz. I am a program officer on the programming side of Internet freedom. We have a very closely knit team, and our programming mandate comes from the policy side of the team. I work along with Laura Motaz, who is down here, who many of you know, I'm sure, and Betsy Brayman, who many of you met doing double duty as Internet freedom expert and registration table minder when you came in the door. So our mandate for Internet freedom comes from, among other things, the President's plan for his international strategy for cyberspace, which came out originally in 2011, and it laid out the USG-wide strategy for cyberspace, but there's a section focused on Internet freedom. Some of those, many of those sections are the focus of our programming and policy, and we also collaborate with other parts of the building, the other parts of the State Department on some of those objectives. So fundamentally what we're interested in is helping to secure fundamental freedoms online. What that means is, yes, the internet and digital technologies are remarkable, exceptional things are happening, but we recognize all of the same fundamental freedoms in the digital space, and where the digital space intersects with the physical world. And that's consistent as well with General Assembly resolution of which the U.S. is a signatory, saying essentially the same things. Fundamental freedoms, including all those that we've been discussing here, apply the same way online as they do in the offline world, and the internet helps to support the offline world activities. So as part of that mandate, the president laid out some objectives, including supporting civil society actors in achieving reliable, secure, and safe platforms for freedoms of expression and association. This is much of the core of what we do, including encouraging people all over the world to use digital media to express opinions, share information, monitor elections, expose corruption, and organize social and political movements, etc. Likewise, the strategy lays out a goal of collaborating with civil society and NGOs to establish safeguards in protecting their internet activity from unlawful intrusions. This is where cybersecurity becomes important, and many of the groups that we work with, that you help to support, face digital threats every day. We collaborate here with another office within the State Department, the coordinator for cyber issues, Chris Painter. Chris Painter runs that office. And we also do a lot of programming in this area, digital safety, et cetera. Another objective is to ensure the end-to-end interoperability of an internet that's accessible to all. This begins to relate to internet governance and the discussions we're having in international fora about whether or not we maintain a global internet, or whether or not policies of governments worldwide begin to create a splinternet. And we work with the Economic Bureau, including Ambassador Sepulveda and Undersecretary Novelli on some of those issues. And those are at fora like the ITU and IGF. And we've supported some of you in the room to do things like help to send civil society to these fora so that they have a voice. Very quickly, the general categories of support that our office looks into are supporting technology for both anti-censorship and secure communications, supporting advocacy and public policy, for capacity building for local advocates to discourage bad laws and policies and encourage good laws and policies, and there's support for them in international venues like I just mentioned. Digital safety training that's both locally tailored and globally generalizable, and training the trainer models. And research, some amount of research just to inform what we're doing and to know what the state is out there. Freedom House has a fantastic annual report that if you haven't looked at about the state of the internet, you should look at. We also support some rapid response work, an increasing amount of rapid response work, and you have a sort of oversized brief about the Digital Defenders Partnership if you pick that up at the table on the way in. And we try to integrate the work and the objectives of the others at the table and others within the Bureau that work for at-risk and marginalized populations. Disability is an increasing part of what we would like to see integrated into proposals. LGBT, we were already doing work. We'd like to see more work on that. Labor and international religious freedom. And you'll hear more about this later on, but the general structure for programming from the Internet Freedom Perspective is an annual program statement that you can read online that outlines all of these elements, or you can grab me, Laura, or Betsy sometime during the day and ask us more about that and how to find that. Thanks.
So thank you guys. So maybe now let's just open it up to questions from you. You've now heard, I think, at least at kind of the top line level, kind of what we're focusing on. And so any questions to sort of drill down on any of these issues or beyond? Wow, we were obviously very persuasive that these are exactly the right things and how to do it.
I have a question. So my question is for Judy. I think it's really important what you touched on in terms of incorporating people with disabilities, both visible and non-visible, into our programming. And I'd like to ask you just to build up a little bit more what you mean in terms of what the department is looking for when we talk about quality over quantity. So there are obviously a broad range of disabilities that we work with when we do programming abroad. And I'm curious as if there's obviously it varies from context to context, but do particular divisions within the State Department have preferences for the spread of beneficiaries within the disability community, or the quality, I should say, of those interventions? Which do you prefer?
Well, I think you need to look at the purpose of your project. And then you need to look at, as I was giving a small example, if you're looking at a project addressing women in leadership development, then I would say you want to ensure that you're reaching out to disabled women across the board. So we don't have a preference of deaf people over blind people, over intellectually disabled people, over people with learning disabilities. In a project like that, I think what you would be looking for are people who have leadership capacity, who are demonstrating whatever you would want the other women you'd be bringing into the program to be demonstrating. And I think it's important, I appreciate the question. There is an ability in your applications, should you need, for example, to bring an interpreter or have materials put in appropriate media, or if you need to rent a space where you're going to have a meeting that would be accessible and maybe slightly additional amount of money. You can talk to your program officers about how to do that. But I want to be very clear, and I've spoken with GP about this, an accommodation for an individual who'd be participating in a program, or for that matter, would be an employee, is something which is permissible. But I think the most important part for me of your question is, why are you applying for the money? What do you want to do with the project? And then there wouldn't be a reason that you would be excluding someone because they're from the LGBT community or from the disability community or from various faith-based organizations. And I think that's the most critical issue. And I want to just make one other general point. There was a change made in something called Section 503 this year. It's administered by the Department of Labor. It is now requiring that grantees with federal funding employ up to 7% of your staff with disabilities. And so I would encourage you to also go back to your offices to get a better understanding of what OFCCP is requiring on that. And following on what Lisa was saying about the LGBT community, it's also important that you look at subcontracts that you're going to be having and ensuring that your subcontractors are also complying with our law and various other laws.
Thank you.
Sumaya Davila from Outreach Aid to the Americas, and my question is for Mrs. Judith also from Disability Rights. My question is more related to focusing on children. If there is in the policy and priorities, some priorities for children with disabilities.
So I would say in looking at some of the projects that we're currently focusing on regarding implementation of the Disabilities Treaty and leadership development, that's certainly a project which was awarded to Mobility International USA and has 3 subcontractors. They will, in fact, be including parents who have children with disabilities, because our emphasis will be on helping individuals learn about their rights under the CRPD, looking at laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, helping individuals in countries get a better understanding of how to not only work with governments on crafting good pieces of legislation, but really looking at issues of compliance and enforcement and technical assistance. So right now, we don't have any projects which specifically would be looking at issues of children per se, but as I said, the importance of children being able to be granted their human rights is an overall part of the work that's happening. And let me also say thank you, because I think you raised the issue of youth. And so for those of you who are doing work with youth, just like I was saying in the area of gender, if you're doing work in the area of youth, you should be looking for disabled youth. In many countries around the world, countries in particular that have large populations of young individuals, you will also find individuals who have various forms of disabilities. And I've been very impressed with work that I've seen going on in communities within youth organizations that are on their own actually reaching out because they have a clearer understanding of the barriers that disabled youth, their peers, are facing.
Great, thank you. Let's go back to the other side.
Hi, John Richardson with the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at American University. I'm curious if any of you can speak to anything that DRL is doing with respect to business and human rights, particularly with regard to implementing UN guiding principles, and then also whether or not you are doing anything in the area of implementing the human rights reporting requirement for companies operating in Burma.
I'll turn to Lisa and let her answer.
So yes, we do have a team that deals specifically with business and human rights. We have been engaged for a number of years on trying to bring U.S. companies along on the UN guiding principles and also the voluntary principles on security and human rights, the International Code of Conduct for private security providers. We are engaged to a certain degree in extractive industries questions. Coming out of New York, we got the agreement of the White House for us to start work on a national action plan on business and human rights. We are indeed very excited about that. Sorry, the second part of your question was?
Had to do with the human rights reporting requirement as applies to Burma.
So implementation has been somewhat slow, but I think that that is not a reflection of the level of interest. Companies certainly are aware of the reporting requirement and are, we believe, doing what is necessary to comply with the reporting requirements. I know that Coca-Cola has put out their report. We expect that that will serve a precedent for others to fall in line as well.
And if I could say broader than just on Burma, we're meeting as we travel regularly with U.S. businesses and others to encourage them to be utilizing the Americans with Disabilities Act in the countries that they're working in, and because they're not legally obligated to comply with U.S. laws outside of the U.S., but it's been very important that and we've seen some really good work that's beginning to go on with a number of companies that are doing more outreach to look at ways that they can be working both with civil society in the areas of education, but also in areas of mentoring, training, and employment of disabled people.
I think Judy's add-on actually kind of highlights the fact that I think it's very difficult to separate out any of these issues one from the other. I mean, business and human rights having consistent signage in whatever the U.S. entity is, that looks like it's the same here, whether it's, in Company X. It's always a bad strategy, I feel like, to name any particular entity. Company X, and you think when you walk in, it's exactly the same as it is in the United States, but of course, in point of fact, maybe it doesn't have an accessible, restroom, et cetera, et cetera. It may have kids, underage labor, the way in which they may advertise on the internet. Anyway, these issues all have a tendency to get jumbled up. So the point that Judy had made earlier about whatever the area of programming expertise that you are working in, all of these issues, I think, are intertwined and have a facet. So anyway, let us go back to my right side of the room and take that question.
Hi, I'm Susan Wolfenbarger. I'm from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I have a question for everyone. So Assistant Secretary Malinowski mentioned the conflict issues in Syria and Iraq. And I was wondering what programming that DRL does overall or in your individual programs that you might be doing that's related to human rights concerns in these conflict zones.
I'll take a stab at the broadest issue, I think, which is that the conflicts that we are seeing there are directly attributable to, in many cases, just poor governance, whether it's corruption and the feeling of individuals in any society that their officials, elected or otherwise, depending on where you are or the way in which they're elected, governments aren't working on behalf of their citizens. So we do a whole lot of different things to try and engage citizenry, to try and improve the governance programs, not just in a DRL, our own bureau context, but more broadly from the State Department perspective. Anti-corruption, for example, rule of law, transitional justice. These are all areas to kind of attack the same problem. So that's kind of a general answer. Would any of you guys like to sort of specifically chime in on particular programs in any of these areas at this point? I mean, it's hard right now, honestly, just because of the nature of the security situation on the ground to do much of what we want to be doing. So looking ahead, this is where I think Pat Davis is the leader of our global programs team. Really we have to look sort of on the longer term, how we continue to build and, create space in these societies to have these kinds of conversations.
I can chime in at least from an internet freedom perspective. In conflict zones, many times digital safety translates very concretely into physical safety. And that's one area where we're focused and doing active programming. Whether or not you are able to communicate securely without those that are trying to harm you, whether or not you have the tools to secure your digital devices so that if you're kidnapped, you don't end up implicating everyone else that you've had contact with. Whether or not when you are kidnapped or taken into custody, the other folks that you're working with have an ability to, for instance, shut down your account so that those that would harm you and the others that you're working with can't reach out and find others to attack them. Those are all important considerations. Likewise, so that's on the sort of digital safety side. On the freedom of expression association side, there are important considerations, and this begins actually to connect a bit with business and human rights issues, where working with companies, especially large social media companies, to make sure that they rapidly address issues not just of account hijacking for the sake of finding people to persecute, but activities that suppress speech, like false takedowns of Facebook pages that are being used by civil society to organize or to express themselves. And making contacts with those companies, making sure the right people in those companies are aware of these sorts of attacks and these sorts of threats. So that's one way where, although we may not be putting people on the ground and you may not be putting people on the ground, there's plenty of work to be done in terms of increasing safety and making sure that people can continue to communicate in those kinds of environments.
So I'm Jessica Lieberman, Deputy in GP. I'm covering NEA, among other things. So we have a number of programs in addition to the one that Steve was talking about, also in the religious freedom space, conflict reconciliation programs. But later today, you'll have an opportunity to break out and talk to the people who are working on our Middle East programs, and you should seek me or Benton Weishart out, and we can tell you a lot more about what we're doing.
Thank you. Okay, let's go over here.
Hi, hello? Yeah. My name is Louisa Zhang, and I'm a volunteer for several Chinese human rights organizations. So my question is actually kind of a follow-up to that last question, which is what is the availability of funds for human rights defenders' emergency crisis coping situations, including transporting them, hiding them, getting them to a safe place, legal aid, when they're arrested, family support, because oftentimes the governments would go after their family, and then crisis coping, training, and then also financial support for sort of the offline campaigns that you guys were talking about, the intersection between online and offline. Thank you.
The short answer is yes, we do have funding for human rights activists and defenders. These are typically fairly small because they're individual circumstances related grants that we deploy to support people, whether it's getting them out of a particular situation, whether it's providing access to legal mechanisms, legal, attorneys, et cetera, to pay their attorneys, whether it's, helping to provide support for relocation for family members or for them. There's kind of the whole soup to nuts sort of range. As I said, these are typically fairly modest in size. Pat will have to tell me what our overall top line number is on defenders. I don't know offhand.
As Virginia said, we do have various emergency funds, and there are fact sheets out there. Particularly, we have, for the LGBT community, we have what's called Dignity for All, which is implemented by a consortium. There's a fact sheet out there showing how you can access it or point people into the direction of accessing it, but it does exactly, as you said, it can be emergency assistance, whether it's legal assistance, relocation. They are small amounts, generally, well, it's to reimburse costs that they might have. It's generally very, very small in the range of $5,000, but it's meant to be helping in real time so that it moves very, very quickly to deal with those crises. But we also have what's called the Global Equality Fund, which is for our LGBT programs that deals with the broader institutional structural issues.
And what's our sort of top line
For LGBT
funding that would be applied to that? Do you know offhand?
Well, for the overall LGBT Global Equality Fund, it's about $17 million over the next couple of years. It's funded with other donors, corporations and other governments, so it kind of varies every year, but it ranges about $4 million, $5 million a year.
And the GB, the
Right,
global,
although that doesn't necessarily go just to human, sort of defender activities in that context, but.
we also have you have a partnership, right, on gender-based violence?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's also out there in the fact sheet, are preventing and responding to gender-based violence, which is also implemented by a consortium that also does the same type of emergency assistance for victims of particularly egregious gender-based violence, harmful traditional practices, same types of small targeted assistance. It also has advocacy associated with it to advocate for preventing gender-based violence. Again, it's also on the fact sheets out there, how one can access that.
And also the aforementioned Digital Defenders Partnership, big fact sheet. In case you're trying to find it, it's the big one.
And that, actually, I'm sorry if I may, it's quite unique because not only, that one's geared towards getting you the technical assistance in a very quick fashion. For example, if there is a directed digital attack against your website, somebody takes it down, it helps you quickly get it back up. So it's got more of a technical side to it, but it's very fast and very effective.
So I think what this is all highlighted is kind of the range of this. When our implementing partners on the ground identify someone who is, under attack or vulnerable for whatever specific reason, and they identify that person to us, then our machinery sort of kicks into gear. But it is quite broad-based. So, get back over here.
Hi, I'm from Stanford University, Stanford Global Studies, and represent an Asian International Justice Initiative is one of the programs we do. So I have a question about how these policy priorities generally affect grant applications. We're an organization that works heavily in the area of rule of law, transitional justice, and I'm wondering if an organization's grant application, fits the call generally for whatever it is that the call is for, but we don't specifically have a strength in one of these policy priorities. What are the implications of that for our prospects for success with a DRL grant?
I think in the finest State Department tradition, the answer is it depends.
Of course.
Because of the way that our funds are authorized and appropriated by the Congress in terms of streams of funding, there are specific things that we are authorized to use specific types of funding for. So when that gets kind of threaded into the bureaucracy here, different people own different buckets of money, is I guess the way I would put it. So as you are writing grants proposals, I would encourage you to read very, very carefully our request for proposals, because embedded in that, I think you will find some, I don't know, it's not forensic evidence, but I think that will help you understand what the funds that we're going to be using were actually appropriated for. You see what I mean? Because, I won't, speak for my colleagues who work in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, which has a very significant mandate for rule of law programs. We actually work quite collaboratively within the building on these kinds of things, but coming at it from an external perspective, I think you really want to look very carefully at the request for proposal to know whether or not kind of a more general program will fit what maybe a DRL RFP is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so essentially it's read between the lines a little bit on what the policy is, what the policy priority is.
I think yes, and I mean, perhaps what we might take away from this is, where there is a lack of clarity in the request for proposal, I think that we want to hear that from you, so that, we're not trying to be opaque or, obfuscate, but as you'll have noted from our liberal deployment of acronyms and stuff, it's all kind of normal to us, and we try not to, but we do often forget that, this isn't all, crystal clear to people on the outside. Thank you. Over here now, thanks.
Alice Tepper Marlin, Social Accountability International. This question is for Bruce Levine. I was really delighted to hear that the area of attention for migration is growing. And I wondered if you could elaborate a bit about the State Department interest, particularly issues like geographically where, particularly the relative interest in internal migration versus international migration. I believe you were stationed in China for a while, India, China, a number of other questions. Internal migration is the major issue. And particularly what you see is the role of business relative to it. A couple of different specifics about the business role. Best practices, areas where you feel there are opportunities that no businesses have thought of or are acting on.
Sure, thanks. So I think it's mainly a work in progress still. The focus that I was referring to really has to do with transnational migration, in that in places like China, for example, we already deal with migrant labor issues through the labor policies and programs that we have. In fact, most of the labor rights issues in China really fall most heavily on migrants. But internationally, there's room for improvement both on the sending country side and on the receiving country side, and really all the pieces are in place to govern this better. So if you look at the major migration corridors, whether it's between Africa and Europe, Latin America and here, or Southeast Asia and the Middle East, you see similar kinds of things. So, you know, what we would like to see is sending countries work together better to promote better regulation of recruiting agencies and essentially to bargain better with the receiving countries on respect for the rights of their citizens upon arrival. For the receiving countries, basically asking them to live up to their obligations under ILO core conventions with respect to migrants as well as respect for their own citizens. We're trying to find ways to promote discussion of these issues within some of the receiving country societies, which are largely blind to this issue, even though sometimes migrants make up 95% of the workforce. One area of programming that we're starting to look at is to try to get civil society organizations in sending countries together with those of receiving countries so that they can work together based on best practices on both sides to promote the rights of migrants and protect the rights of individuals within the receiving countries. There's a lot to be done, and so you know, as we draft future requests for proposals in the future, we're going to be broad because we want to see what kind of ideas are coming out there from civil society.
Sorry, the last piece
Oh,
of that was
business,
any
yeah.
role for business? Do you see any?
Yeah, there is role for business, and I'm not exactly sure at this point what that's going to look like, but in a place like Qatar, for example, the government itself came out with a list of very high standards, mostly based on ILO recommendations. And we'll be working with American companies to try to get them to make sure that they're implementing that and that they're getting credit and good publicity for the fact that they're doing so, setting an example, being a good model, and encouraging others to follow suit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one last question, if there is one. I think I perceive there is one. Yes, okay, you can be.
Thank you. My question is for Judy. My name is Anne. I'm with the Center for Victims of Torture. You mentioned both visible and invisible disability. I'm wondering if you view or include mental health in that.
Oh, yes. Yes. Sorry if I didn't mention it. And we also have raised the issue of torture as a cause of disability and have met with a number of organizations in some countries that have. I mean, my experience is the following. When you raise this issue, in the case of torture as an example, people will then discuss it. But if disability itself or mental health itself is not necessarily raised, people don't necessarily raise it. So my comment to all of you is, you know, we view those of you who are applying for funding as the ones who are going to be experts. And in the area of disability, LGBT, and labor, whatever the issue may be, it is our expectation that over time you'll get a better understanding both of what the human rights violations are in this area and what needs to be done to address them. And certainly in the area of mental health and mental health problems as a result of torture, it's a critical issue because in many cases these people are not getting any kinds of services and they're relying solely on external organizations to be able to help support them, and it's a very big issue.
Thank you.
All right, thanks to all of you for your questions, and thank you guys for speaking eloquently about some of what we are trying to accomplish overseas. I will now turn it back over to Pat to talk to you in kind of more detail. We're sort of trying the drill down approach. So now I think we've gone from 30,000 feet maybe to 15,000 feet, and now she's going to get right down to sort of terra firma on how kind of nuts and bolts to do this. But thank you very much for coming. We appreciate all the work that you are doing that helps us do a better job worldwide. So thank you.